From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. Today we're going to have a very special program about a very, very special individual who was the fulcrum for most of the major change that occurred during this period, and that's Governor Forrest Anderson. We think of this program as big changes are coming, and they're coming in the person of Forrest Anderson, who was a one-term governor, but in that one term, with what happened with the times that surrounded him, but with the actions that he took as governor, he is seen as perhaps the most important governor in the history of the state of Montana. We have some special guests with us today who know Governor Anderson well, one personally and one historically. So I would want to mention that we have a well-known historian in Montana, Brian Chovers, who is recently retired from the Montana Historical Society and is now delving full-time into history. And he happens to be the author of a very magnificent article in Montana, the Magazine of Western History. And in this article, it's a 20-page article about Forrest Anderson. So, by the way, if you don't get Montana, the Magazine of Western History, you ought to. And the best way to do that is to be a member of the Montana Historical Society. So, good point of reference. But Brian wrote a wonderful history on the governor. And joining him is Newell Anderson. Newell is one of three children of Forrest Anderson. He's the youngest and the only son. And Newell brings the personal insights to what Forrest Anderson's makeup was. What was in his background, his history, and his natural inclinations that made him the effective leader that he was. And so I would want to start a little bit with you, Newell, but before I do, let me mention that Newell's a graduate of Northern Montana College, spent his professional life in education, in economic development, in trade. He worked for Governor Judge and Governor Schwinden both with the Old West Regional Commission, ran for state auditor unsuccessfully in a very close race in 1984, and then spent 20 years doing great work with the Department of Commerce. So he's got a wonderful background, but that's part of what is the strength of your father. Your father had an extraordinary background that brought him to the governorship with more experience than anyone probably in the history of the state even came close to having as far as that's concerned. But we'll get to that experience in a minute, the personal reflections about what makes up Forrest Anderson. And as his son, you know all the family stories, you were a close observer. What was it in his makeup, in his upbringing, that gave him the strengths that you think he brought to the governorship?
You know, Evan, I think it's important at the beginning that I clearly state that I'm prejudiced. I mean, being his son, I have to believe he was the greatest dad, and all of the things that he did were the greatest thing. But that said, I think there's a couple of parts of his history, his personal history, that I feel are indicative of what he was as governor and what he was as a politician. He was the youngest of 3 sons. He was a family of 5 people, or 5 children. He was born to immigrant parents who were both, his dad was Oscar Anderson from Sweden, and his mother was Nora O'Keefe from Ireland. And you know, I think there was a very strong discipline of family and early development that existed in their household. His oldest brother, Harold, was the intellectual and the one presumed to be the most likely to succeed because he was so good in school and he excelled in everything that he did. His second oldest brother was Mickey, who was an athletic type, very social and very involved in athletics and different things in high school. And father was kind of the third son. He wasn't particularly intellectual. He was bright, but he wasn't the valedictorian, and he was physical, but he wasn't on the football team, and he wasn't on the basketball team. And around the dinner table, which is, as immigrant parents, I guess, often did, one of the basic rules of the family was everybody had to be there for dinner. You just didn't do anything other than be there for dinner. One night he came home and they were sitting around the dinner table, and his father looked up at him and he said, "Son," he said, "I got a call from the director of the YMCA today." And I think father was probably in his early teens. And his father said, "Well, what did he have to say?" And he said, "Well," he said, "he gave me some bad news." He said, there was a thievery at the Y today, and somebody stole somebody's Letterman jacket, and it was found in your locker. And the director of the YMCA, which was a major social place for young people at the time in Helena, said, you know, obviously your son Forrest stole this guy's Letterman's jacket, and that's wrong. And father was pretty amazed at the story, was pretty floored at the accusation, and was probably, as he described the story, and he didn't talk a lot about it, but as he described the story, was pretty amazed that his father would believe the director of the YMCA and not even ask him for his side of the story. And being the kind of the third son and the one who didn't get a lot of recognition in the accomplishments and awards of his development, kind of felt left out. And being a bit of a hothead, personally, independent, he stood up and he picked up the dining room table and he just turned it over, and all of the stuff went right towards his dad. He turned around and left, and he didn't come back for 2 weeks. He was out hunting and fishing in the mountains in western Montana, a thing that he found a great deal of solace in. And it took him out into both nature and into the world of people and the world of the common man, the workers, the people that did the lumbers and the cattle and those kinds of things. And I think that story, though it by itself doesn't maybe seem to mean much, it was the idea that you can be accused of doing something and be perfectly innocent, and you have to be really careful of the accuser and the innocence and the story and the facts. And it kind of gave him an opportunity as a young person to say, you know, I've got to stand up for myself. I can't presume that the system's going to be fair or that I'm always going to be right. So
I think maybe perhaps it might speak to the idea that his personal honor was important to him.
Exactly.
Because he must have carried that sense of honor forward.
He did. And I think that story kind of is indicative of his independence. One of the things that I think father was born with that was a little bit extraordinary, and it's not something that you can measure, but father always seemed to have a kind of a sixth sense of intuition. He had an extraordinary amount of intuition into things and places and people and circumstances that I never saw anywhere in my life, you know, during being a child, being his son, and clear up through his successful political career. And I think that independence and that intuition kind of made a large mark on how he evolved into the person that he ultimately was.
It is interesting that while he didn't participate in the athletic stuff that much, he was what you would think of as a Montana outdoorsman.
He was.
Which is a different sense of athleticism, but it's being out there and fishing and hunting, and he was so well known for that. And that story of him going off for 2 weeks to fish and hunt to find solace is a very interesting thing, because this is a state of sportsmen.
Exactly.
A state of sportsmen.
Well,
yeah.
and it was the beginning of ultimately what was another interesting fact of his early youth. It took him 14 years to get through 12 years of school, because in his life, it was as important during hunting season in the fall to go hunting as it was to learn history and science. So he would just pick up and be gone for a month or 2 months in the fall, and it took him a lot longer to get through high school than it did most kids. But the importance of the outdoors was extraordinary to him, and I think he did a lot of thinking out there. He did a lot of learning out there, and I think he was as good of a hunter and as good of a fisherman as anybody I ever knew. And once again, I think in a kind of an abstract way, it showed his intuition. You could look at a landscape and say, well, where will the deer be? And you'd say, well, they're most likely to be down in that valley. And he'd say, no, I think they just went around that hill over there, and they'll be coming over there. And if we just sit right over here, they'll come right to us. And it made absolutely no sense to me or to the other people that were hunting with him, but we usually followed his intuition. And sure enough, you'd go over and sit in the side of the mountain, and within a half hour, the deer would come around the side just like he said they would. And you'd look at a fishing hole and you'd say, is this a good fishing hole? And he'd say, no, this isn't the right one. It looked perfect according to all of the readings that you'd have about where a good fishing hole would be. And he'd point to another place, and he'd catch 10 times as many fish as you would, even though you were looking at the most perfect fishing hole in the river.
You know, he was a product of the Great Depression. And when he finished his 14-year saga of getting his high school degree, he wasn't able to afford to go to the university here at home. Tell us, what did he do?
Well, he started at the University of Montana, but it was, as you say, during the Depression. Ultimately, he couldn't afford to live in Missoula outside of his home. He couldn't afford the tuition, and he couldn't afford to be there. And there were no jobs. There were no jobs in Missoula. He couldn't get a job in Helena. His dad had a clothing store here in town, and his dad wasn't making enough money in the clothing store to hire his own son to be able to afford his education. So he and his dad got together, and his dad, being a clothier here in Helena, put him in, fitted him for a really good suit. He ended up packing the suit and some of his belongings into a bag, and he hitchhiked. He thumbed his way literally back to Washington, D.C. during the Depression, and got a job working days for the federal government in the Roosevelt administration. He was an auditor in the Social Security Administration, which was in the very, very early days of its existence. And while he went to school during the day, making enough money to live on, he also made enough money to go to night school, and he ended up getting his college degree and his law degree in Washington, D.C. during that time.
Now that was at a school that was called Columbia Law or something, but it's really what is now George Washington University.
It is, yes.
So he ended up in a pretty prominent place getting a degree in law, and but he had to work his way through, like probably everybody in those days.
Exactly.
And that colors you a bit in terms of your attitudes when you know the struggle. The struggle that you have is a struggle that almost everybody had. I think it may have colored his attitudes toward that government can be a proactive force for the good of people. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think he came by his humanitarianism naturally in his own family, but I think it strengthened quite a bit by working and living in Washington, D.C. during the depths of the Depression and working with some of the programs of the Roosevelt administration that were helping people help themselves. So, yeah, exactly.
Now, you came back, decided to come back. Had he, by the way, met and married your mom yet, or did he do that when he came back?
He married her when he came back.
When he came back. And very quickly he decided he wanted to run for office.
Exactly. Yeah. He ran for the legislature in, I think, 1940, was it?
I think
43?
42, because he was in the 43 session, so in 1942, yeah.
And he was a member of the House. He was successfully elected as a member of the House. He was a young, good-looking guy with dark hair, and as he went into what they called the House of Lords, the junior House of Lords, the House of Representatives, he had, as the rest of the Lewis and Clark County delegation, a bunch of white-haired senior men in his prime, or in his company, which I think kind of epitomizes a lot of his existence in his youth. You try to say things like, you surround yourself with good people. Well, he found himself wanting to be surrounded by interesting people and wise people and experienced people. So no matter where he was, whether he was hunting or in Washington, working in the Roosevelt administration or in the legislature, he was always around older people, and he always worked as hard as he could to try to find the best and the brightest of the old people and works, accumulate their wisdom and accumulate their insights. But he served one term as a member, as the junior member of the junior House of Lords.
And then he put his law into more into practice as a county attorney in the election in 1944, huh?
Yeah, he was elected county attorney in 44. Really short, interesting story about Helena at the time. Gambling was kind of on the edge, but I don't think it was illegal. And he used to get a phone call from the mayor of Helena on a Saturday morning, and the mayor would say, "Mr. County Attorney, Sally Jones's husband came in off the rails last night and went down to the corner bar, and he spent his entire paycheck, and Sally can't afford to buy milk and food for the kids. I want you to go down to the corner bar, and I want you to tell the proprietor of the corner bar that you want, 220 of the $235 that he lost last night at the bar. I want you to give it back to him, and I want you to take that to Sally and make sure that she has enough money to buy shoes and clothes and food for the kids." It was a different time. It was clearly a different time, but it was an intriguing time and an interesting time.
Now he had an amazing record of wins politically, but apparently when he ran for re-election as county attorney, he suffered the consequences of not having been able to serve during World War II, and somebody came home who was a veteran and took him out, so to speak.
Exactly. He actually predicted that it would be hard to get reelected as county attorney, even though he'd served a term, because a veteran came home. And he wasn't proud of the fact that he wasn't a veteran, but he was medically disabled from what they used to call a stone man's disease right before the war, where it was a partial paralysis. It was a rheumatoid kind of thing. And he spent 6 weeks at the Mayo Clinic being treated on a syndrome that I guess some people ultimately kind of froze to a stone. I mean, they were literally permanently paralyzed. He was lucky enough to have the treatment necessary to get through that and completely recover. and never have it returned. But that's kind of a long, complicated story.
But you know, in one sense, that loss, political people always, I always presume, learn more from losing than from winning. and it actually created an opportunity 2 years after that. He wasn't a sitting county attorney 2 years after that, when there was an open seat on the Supreme Court, and it kind of took him to, he went after that, and it took him to a newer level. And although that was the only other race that he lost, he won the primary enough to get into the general. It was 4 on the ballot, and you can vote for 2 is the way it was, and he made it past the primary, but got beat in the general. But he whetted his appetite on this Supreme Court thing in 1950. So in 52, he ran again for a single seat, and he ran away with it. He ran away with it, and that set him off on a string of 10 consecutive statewide elections that he won. A pretty amazing record. This Supreme Court thing, and I want you to give some reflections on that from what you might have heard from him about the Supreme Court, and then I'm going to ask Brian a little bit about it too, because he managed to pick up some insights on that Supreme Court thing too as well. But how did he fit in the Supreme Court? Because all of a sudden here he is, a still pretty young guy. With my recollection is they were a bunch of old guys in that Supreme Court at that time.
Very much so.
Hugh Adair was the chief, and he'd been around since the 30s. And you know, all of a sudden here he's a young guy on the Supreme Court. What did he think about that?
Well, an interesting story about his campaigning, and I think one of the things that was really important about that race in his career was he learned a lot about campaigning. I mean, he was out there, he and Johnny Morgan were the only 2 on the campaign. There were no TV ads. There was, you know, it was, I'm guessing it probably was a $2,000 or $3,000 campaign statewide. It was much different than we.
They used to travel the state in car caravans to get to all the small towns.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he came across a lady once out in eastern Montana. One of the stories of his political learning. And he went up to this lady and he said, "Hi, I'm Forrest Anderson. I'm running for the Supreme Court. I'd appreciate your vote." And she looked at him and she says, "Oh, you're way too young to be a Supreme Court judge," which is not an unusual thing for somebody to say, I would guess, at the time. But he looked at her and he was quick-witted enough to say, "Oh, no, don't misunderstand me." He said, "I'm just running for an associate justice of the Supreme Court. I'm not running for the Chief Justice. I'm not old enough to be the Chief Justice, but I'm just running for an associate." She said, "Okay, you got my vote." So he was successful in 52 to be elected, and you know, I think once again he was considered the junior member of the House of Lords, because the Supreme Court is a House of Lords. It was a much different judiciary at the time, same laws, same kinds of circumstances intellectually, but there was one secretary and she worked for the chief, and there were 4 justices or associate justices, and there were no law clerks. You wrote all your own briefs, and when you wanted your brief typed and you were assigned a case and you were to write the majority opinion, you had to ask the chief if you could borrow his secretary to type it up. And so the world, the mechanics of the Supreme Court, the mechanics of government altogether were significantly different. But he found himself in that circumstance for 4 of the 6 years of that term, kind of being on the outside. He wrote a significant number of dissenting opinions because, as you say, the senior judges on the court were of a different persuasion and of a different mindset.
I think, by the way, one case can be made that they strongly reflected, like most of Montana government at the time, the interests of the Anaconda Company.
Very much so, yes.
And so he was obviously not comfortable with that.
Yes.
Didn't wear the copper collar well, and filed a lot of dissenting opinions. One of them was on the Legislative Council, wasn't it, Brian?
Yeah, he was the dissenting vote. The legislature had passed a bill to establish the Legislative Council, which was created to help legislators learn about what they were doing. And it was a significant piece of legislation, and later we'll talk about how it affected executive reorganization and all. But so he was the one, it was declared unconstitutional, and he was the one dissenting vote. And when he became Attorney General, that decision kind of followed him, and eventually during his term as Attorney General, the Legislative Council was approved and really led the way to some major changes in the way government operated in the 1960s.
Well, and again, the modernization of either the executive branch, which he later delved into in historic proportions, and the modernization of the legislature, the strengthening of the mechanics of state government, were not in the interests of the power structure of the state,
Right.
which did very well by having a weak government.
Right.
So when they were reflecting on this, I think his dissent was a sign of something to come, which was the people taking over, the very subject of this entire series of films.
Right.
And that was probably emblematic of it, that dissent, and among the other dissents that he had. But he kind of chafed under it, so he was elected to a 6-year term, but he only served 4 of it, because there was an opening for Attorney General when Arnold Olson, who was sitting Attorney General, decided to run for governor in 1956 against J. Hugo Aronson. Then your father decided to run for Attorney General. As I look at that, in 1956, he had primary opposition against Pat Gilfether, but he thumped him. He thumped him. I mean, he'd been, I think it paid off, the fact that he'd been on the statewide ballot already a few times and knew how to campaign, because he won way better than 2-1 in the primary. And then he won, looks like he got about almost 60% of the vote in the general. So he did really well in 1956. And that was a year, by the way, when the presidential race was on, and Ike was up for re-election, and he won overwhelmingly, and Aronson won re-election. So he was going against the tide, so to speak. Then I think it showed the strength he'd been developing at the ballot box. Yeah.
Exactly.
And suddenly he's Attorney General, and served for 12 years.
3 terms, right?
3 terms. 3 terms, and overwhelmingly elected. I mean, from that point forward, he was not opposed in the primary for Attorney General, and it looks to me like he was, again, getting maybe 65% of the vote each time for Attorney General, and making his mark. But we've been told by some folks that he was kind of biding his time, trying to sort it out and figure out what to do, when to run for governor. And Gordon Bennett told a wonderful story in his interview about the prison over there, and when he thought it was the very time when your dad looked at it and said, you know, I think I can be governor. When Aronson turned over the problem in the prison and said, you, take care of it. And he took care of it in a very brave and forthright way, and kind of looked at it and said, I guess I can be governor, and then just waited for the right time, it looked like. What are your recollections about that, about the timing of 12 years is a long time to be Attorney General?
Well, I think about the Attorney General's job. Father used to say frequently, and not terribly publicly, but frequently in conversation with his friends and family, that the job that he operationally got the most satisfaction out of in his entire career was Attorney General, because he could actually help more people and get more things done himself than he could in any of the other capacities that he had previously served. And I think in reflection after he was governor, he would have felt the same way too. I think he enjoyed the governorship, but I really think that the capacity to interpret the law and to enforce the law and to kind of manage the law from the Attorney Generalship gave him some real intrigue in being able to help people do things and help things happen. in a very quiet way.
One of his hallmarks, it seems, in my observation, was his ability to attract and find extraordinarily capable and talented and good people. And that evidenced itself right in the Attorney General's office. When you look at the people that he had hired as Assistant Attorneys General, there was a phenomenal crop of people he had there that stood out in the legal profession in Montana for decades after that. Some remarkable people. My mentor, Duke Crowley, was one of them. But Gordon Bennett was another one. But there was a whole cadre of people that he called upon to come and join him in what his mission was, and they were really capable people. It spoke to his ability to judge people, I think, quite a bit. Did you have reflections on?
Yeah, and I think that was a great secret to his success, was who he surrounded himself with, and it goes back to my earlier comment about his intuition. He had a great insight into people. He could, with a fairly short experience with a person, know that person very well and know that person's capacities and strengths and limitations. I always maintained, and this may be kind of unfair to say, but I always maintained he was one of the greatest personal managers I ever saw in my life, and I always kind of wished I could have gotten to that point in my career, but it was not possible, nor did I have the talent to do it. But his secret to a good day was coming out and having breakfast, sitting at the dining room table or living kitchen table, eating his cornflakes and reading 2 or 3 different newspapers, and then making 4 or 5 phone calls to key people on key issues, and then spending the rest of the day going fishing. I mean, he had the insight to know who could do what, how well, and he knew the circumstances of the issues as they evolved quickly enough that he could solve the day or the week's problem in an hour and a half on the telephone by making assignments, and spend the rest of the time out on the Missouri River fishing.
Which was probably great for his mental health,
exactly,
too.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, in 1968, we look upon the period of the crucible of change as being 1965 to 1980. But the first dramatic and important statewide election for governor, which is the predominant important office for dealing with the people of Montana, was in 1968. Tim Babcock was the incumbent, was running for re-election. He'd been re-elected in 64. And there'd been a Donnybrook of a fight in the legislature over the sales tax. And Jim Felt, the Speaker of the House, had advanced a big sales tax agenda. And it had been stopped by Gene Mahoney, the head of the Senate, Democratic head of the Senate. And so when it came time to run for governor, although there were 6 people on the Democratic primary ballot, the 2 big ones, the 2 big names were Mahoney and Forrest Anderson. And they duked it out. And he won by a fairly narrow amount. Tell us about your visit the night of the election, the primary election.
We were having he was having a campaign party at the house, which is typical of people running for elections. And it was early in the returns. Of course, back in '68, even as current as that is, returns were slow to come. They weren't nearly as automated and as easy to get as they are now. But he, sometime early in the evening, came over to me, and I was in college at the time, came over to me at the house, and he said, "Let's go for a walk." We walked out the back door of the house and out into the alley and started walking down the alley. We probably walked 2 blocks through alleys, and he never said a word, and I could tell he had something pretty serious on his mind. And pretty soon he turned to me and he said, "You know, son," he said, "I might lose this one." He said, "This is the toughest election I've ever had in my entire career, and I just might lose this one." And I mean, what do you say? I think you'll be fine, and give him the encouragement. But I think he knew that the size of the primary field and the split of the different parts of the party Senator Mahoney having Labor and the Organized Democratic Party, Senator Leroy Anderson having the Farmers Union, and Mike Kuchera having a good
All
number
the polka dancers.
a good number of people in Billings who loved his
yeah.
TV ads. You know, I think he realized that it was a tough race, and you know, unfortunately, the other part of that party, we went back to the House, and it was pretty quiet for the longest time. Was the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy.
Down in California.
That just kind of shut down the whole election party process, and everybody went home. But it was late at night or early in the morning until we finally got to the point where we could say, you know, I think we're going to win this primary.
It was about a 3,500 vote win, very tight against Mahoney.
Mm-hmm.
But I bring that up because it speaks to that issue of what he did, how he managed people.
Mm-hmm.
And this was about the time I was starting to get my my fingers a little bit wet in the politics of Montana. And what he did was take a whole bunch of really, really good people, and he didn't practice the politics of exclusion. He didn't say, you were for Mahoney, I don't want you near me. He sorted out who were the good ones, and he went and had conversations with them, and he reached out and he said, I want you to be part of my team. And he practiced the politics of inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And that speaks to that people awareness and intuition and management of people that some of the people that were critically important over the next decade, even beyond his term, were people that he brought in that way. It spoke, I think, so well to his sense of vision about moving things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think kind of leading up to the choice of running for governor, I know Judge Bennett talked about the prison riot and, you know, looking at the governor and saying, maybe I could do that. Quite frankly, I don't think his family, the children or my mother, really thought that he ever wanted to be governor. There was an element of kissing babies and schmoozing that just wasn't particularly his style, that we felt was probably a big impediment for him to ever choose that kind of a thing, and a satisfaction of where he was. But before he actually went into the race, he called the family together at the house one day, my two older sisters and myself and my mother, and he said, you know, I've been giving it a lot of thought, and he says, I'm seriously considering running for governor, and he said, I'm going to tell you why. He said, I'm old enough, and I'm mature enough, and I'm wise enough to be governor. And he felt very strongly that you know, he had to feel solid in the idea of actually practicing the function of being governor effectively, or he wasn't interested in getting into it. He said, secondly, he said, you know, the other part of it is, and this is no condemnation of anybody else, but it always meant, quite frankly, a lot to the family. He said, I think you people, you folks, the kids in particular, are old enough and wise enough for me actually to run and to win. And he said, you know, you probably don't quite understand what that means right now, but he said, from my perspective as a father, I wanted to wait. I knew that I had to wait until my family was grown before I got into the buzzsaw of kind of that second tier of politics. It's much different to be the governor than it is to be the attorney general in public scrutiny and in public conversation and those kinds of things. And he said the third thing, and probably one of the more important things, is he says, I know what I want to do as governor. And he said, I have like three things in my mind that I know the state of Montana could greatly benefit from. And he said, I think I have the wisdom and the experience to be able to manage their successful accumulation into the government. And he said, you know, with the combination of those three things, he says, I think I'm ready, and he says, I think the times are ready for me to run for governor. And I'm not sure if before that he had thought he wanted to be or whatever, but he never talked about it.
Yeah.
But at that night, it really kind of confirmed.
Well, you know, he ended up winning overwhelmingly against an incumbent governor. And that was a sign of changing times in a lot of ways, but also his strength. Again, that 10 straight wins was pretty powerful. Let's talk about that substance and talk to you, Brian, a bit about this. And we're going to focus in on four major things if we can: executive reorganization, the sales tax, the Board of Investments, investment of public monies, and the Constitutional Convention. There's so much else to talk about, but we're going to try to focus in on that. But let me just first say that Brian is from Wisconsin. He ended up with a degree at Berkeley, ended up in Montana through a strange journey to get to Montana. We won't go into that, but nonetheless, he went to MSU and got a master's in history, went back to Madison, Wisconsin, and got his master's in library science, was at Temple for 2 years, and then starting in 1993, went to the Montana Historical Society, where he was the principal historical librarian, and after 21 years, recently retired. He got a phenomenal grasp of history, and he did a wonderful job of encapsulating in this magazine article, 20 pages, the essence of the governorship of Forrest Anderson. And let's talk, which one do you want to hit first? Reorg, sales tax, Board of Investments, ConCon, what?
Well, to begin with, I guess what I'd like to say is that in politics, timing is everything. And Forrest Anderson had timing on his side. If you look at where Montana was at in 1968, they'd had 16 years of Republican rule of the governor's office, and during that time period, Montana ranked 47th in the nation out of 50 states in terms of economic development and growth. The per capita income was below the national average, and between 1940 and 1968, Montana, half of the farms in Montana had disappeared or been consolidated. If you look at what's going on in Butte, the shift from underground mining to open pit mining, the Berkeley pit is 1955, cut the employment in Butte for miners in half. Butte had just experienced one of the worst strikes in the town's history, 1967-68, and there were just a huge number of unemployed and unhappy people in Butte. So times were ripe for a change, and Anderson actually took a page out of the Republican playbook in that campaign. So he campaigned against the sales tax, which, as it turned out, a large majority of Montanans were against this 3% sales tax. They actually accepted a 30% surcharge
that was in 71, in lieu of that, yeah. But think about it, yeah, you're right, he did go right at it, and he had that, what is perhaps the most memorable and effective campaign slogans in simple words that he ran on.
So it was pay more, what for?
Pay more, what for?
And in addition to that, there was just lots of turmoil in the country. You know, you had the war in Vietnam going on. You had huge civil rights, lots of urban unrest. Montana seemed pretty far away from that, but people were still aware of it, and there were lots of changes about to happen in terms of environmental law. In 1959, the Anaconda Company sold all the major newspapers that they owned in Montana to Lee Enterprises, an Iowa outfit, and Anaconda's power was definitely diminishing. You know, you still had Montana Power, but things were ripe for change.
Things were being shaken up all around the country, but he specifically came in and, say with executive reorganization, very skillfully done, shook up Montana government and made sense out of it.
I mean, Montana government up until that point was operating under terms formulated in 1889. I mean, this was almost a century before, and you know, this was a modern society, but these rules that had been laid down in the Constitution in 1889 were really prohibiting the efficiency of government, during those 16 years under Republican governors, they'd created 32 new departments in state government. I mean, they couldn't pay for what they had.
There were almost 200 entities in the state executive branch.
161 boards, commissions, and agencies, and his whole pledge was 20's plenty. That was another advertising thing
Oh,
that he used.
that resonated too. That was another 70% vote.
And so executive reorganization was happening at this time in about 15 to 20 other states around the country. It wasn't just Montana. You look at Colorado, Oregon, New York, Wisconsin. I mean, it was happening all over the country. And so his whole thing was that this government, you know, we're living in a modern day world, but with a 19th century government. So it's incredibly inefficient. There's this maze of agencies that the citizen has to wade through to try to find out what's going on. There was no responsibility set for who was responsible for, you know, these various decisions. And the League of Women Voters really deserves credit for leading the educational campaign. In 1962, they published a booklet which outlined the problems in Montana state government. And Anderson was aware of that and actually, you know, was aided tremendously by the work of the League of Women Voters, who had representatives all over the state. And they were sort of a non-political organization. They were just interested in good government.
Well, and
that could serve the people.
if you think about his upbringing in the Depression and his going to work in the Roosevelt administration in the New Deal, and his innate understanding that government can do good for people, when you have an ineffective government, how do you help people with it? Mm-hmm. So he went in with an agenda, which is to make this government workable. That was, in full disclosure, was when I went to work for state government, was to assist in the development of the reorganization plan that he very skillfully directed being put together as chairman of the commission. And he played out the politics of that it'd take too long to describe because we've done it on some other programs, but he set it up so that it all got done and it was then enforced by the Constitution of Montana. 20 departments. Forget about this 160, 180, whatever it was, you know, by gosh, there's going to be 20, and the people said there would be 20, and they put it in the Constitution, and it was a marvelous stroke of political genius in my mind to get it done that way.
And the key to it, I think, was hiring Duke Crawley, William Duke Crawley, who was a Butte boy, but taught at the law school in Missoula and had worked with him in the Attorney General's office. So he hired Duke to administer the commission, to be director of the commission. And a guy by the name of George Boselman was hired to be his assistant. And he hired young college graduates like yourself and Sheena Wilson and Diana Dowling, and there was a whole crew of people. And they actually created, I think, 22 different reports and over 1,800 pages of text relating to what the problems were in these various agencies and how they could be streamlined and made more efficient. And there was really not that much opposition to the executive reorg. And in fact, when this referendum, constitutional amendment, was put on the ballot saying that by 1973 there will be no more than 20 departments, it passed overwhelmingly.
That's 70% of the vote.
Yeah.
70% of the vote.
Right.
But there was a persuasion in that. And so he really got that done. And Alec Hansen, in his discussions with us in an earlier program, made the point that Governor Anderson said, I may not benefit from this reorganization, but all future governors are going to benefit from what we've just done here today. Now, we need to rock and roll here a little bit, but we want to hit on the sales tax, but the investment thing maybe, huh?
So, as I understand it, it was Forrest and his executive director of reorg, Duke Crawley, who came up with an idea for the Montana State Board of Investments. Mm-hmm. At the time, all of the state revenues were distributed in banks around the state, local banks, and the state was getting 1% interest. These local banks were turning around and loaning the money at 7 or 8%. I mean, the state of Montana was getting nothing for these revenues. And so they created the State Board of Investments that would invest the money, basically in the stock market. And within a year, they had accrued over $1 million, and that money could be used for loans to local governments, for government projects and such, and local development, economic development. And today, that fund is worth over $13 billion.
$13 billion
Yes.
is being invested by this board
Right.
and making money far and above, their rate of return is far and above what most average people get.
Right.
And historically, that is, kind of set the tone. So Montana right now is seen as one of the most fiscally responsible states in the nation, and a centerpiece of their ability to be looked at, our ability to be looked at that way, is this Board of Investments. And saying, wait a minute, we're not going to be taken for chumps here. We're going to take our money and make it earn for the citizens. And that kind of slipped in quietly in the reorganization process. They kind of slid it in there and didn't make a big deal about it. And the banks, I think, discovered it at the last minute, but it was too late to stop it. And besides, who likes banks? I mean, that was when you're doing battle with the banks, it's a different ballgame. How about the CONCON? The governor's role in the CONCON, because that was a subtle thing.
Okay, and at this time, again, there were, 16 other states that were looking at revising their constitutions, and Montana turned out to be one of the successful ones, and in large part to the way the whole situation was put together. In the language of, there was a referendum that went on the ballot to establish a constitutional convention, and this was prompted by some work done by Ellis Waldron. He was a political scientist at the University of Montana and had
Author of our Bible here.
and had studied the past politics in Montana. And a woman by the name of Marjorie Brown, who was actually a PhD student at Missoula at the time in history, and her dissertation topic was the 1889 Constitution. And that Constitution was basically put forward by William A. Clark, the Copper King from Butte. And so there were all kinds of
Special deals.
for mining interests in Montana.
Yeah.
And, a great fear of too powerful an executive, a great fear of the legislature even, a really antiquated justice system. And so both Ellis and Marjorie recommended, they said, we need a constitution for the 20th century. And as Forrest said in one of his State of the State messages the first year, we've landed a person on the moon, we've tapped the atom, and we're operating our government with a system that was devised in the 19th century. And we really need to revise this. And so there was the call for the Constitutional Convention that was widely popular. I think it passed by 70% again of the public. And but they put some limitations. They said nobody who is currently occupying a public office could serve as a delegate. There were to be 100 delegates. And in the end, they elected, I think, 58 Democrats and 36 Republicans, and I think there were 6 independents. But the brilliant thing that they did upon that election was said that everybody's going to be seated alphabetically rather than by political party. So that was a great coup. And the person put in charge, the president of the convention, was Leo Graybill, who was a Yale University educated lawyer from Great Falls, but a very powerful Democratic politico. I mean, he had run for the Eastern congressional seat a couple times unsuccessfully, but he was selected to lead the group, and he, basically put aside partisan politics during that time that they met, and they removed some of the most contentious issues from discussion.
Well, and in reality, Governor Anderson seemed to sense the need for it not to look political.
Right.
And so he, though I understand, was pulling a lot of strings and talking to a lot of people behind the scenes about things, he didn't get out in front.
No.
However, he was a strong supporter of the new Constitution. evidenced by when they had the vote, and there was a technicality about whether that was a plurality or a majority that won, and he, with the stroke of a pen, signed a document deliberately to stop legal action against the Constitution and said, it has passed. And it changed the whole legal tenor of the challenges, and we ended up with the new Constitution in a large measure because of his fairly savvy legal move that he did, which is both a legal and political move, as I recall it.
Right. And he was advised on that by Duke Crowley again. You know, he was significant.
He always said that Duke was kind of like his lawyer.
Yeah.
You know, but those guys were terrific together. And all the way back in the Attorney General's office, and then with the reorganization, then there's this constitutional thing. So he was savvy enough, Governor Anderson was savvy enough to not be overt.
Right.
And make it a political document, and it barely passed even that way.
But
he made sure it passed.
It passed by only 2,500 votes statewide. The 12 urban counties all approved it. The 44 rural counties all voted against the new Constitution, and it was opposed by the Montana Farm Bureau Federation and the Montana Taxpayers Association, and of course the
Conner Company and the Power Company,
right.
and the powers that be that liked the way things were, didn't like that Constitution being changed the way it did, but he saw it for what it was worth. So we don't have time to get in the sales tax, we're going to run out of time here, but it's very interesting to see that what he brought to the table from his early life and his personal attributes in 4 years may have had a dramatic impact in terms of the tax structure of Montana, the Constitution of Montana, the executive branch reorganization, the strengthening of the legislative branch, the investment of the public's money, and the public trust, trying to make government effectively working for people. It's a pretty amazing record of accomplishment for someone to do in 4 years. And maybe it gets back to what we talked about, and we're going to wrap it up pretty quickly here, is he went in knowing what he wanted to get done. And he focused in on it to get it done.
Yep, exactly. And a lot of people ask, do you think your dad would have liked to have been a two-term governor? And you know, it's hard to say because it didn't happen. His health obviously was a major factor in his deciding not to be run for re-election. But in practice, I think you'd have to say that he accomplished what he set out to accomplish when he decided to run for governor in the first term. And I don't think he left the governor's office with any regrets, saying, if I'd have stayed longer, I could have done more. I think he probably could have done more. But in that one term, I think he accomplished a great deal and was very satisfied.
And he was the fulcrum, again, of which all this change occurred from him. And a 20-year period of Democratic governors, a key portion of which was in this crucible of change period, it would not have be what it is. The progressive change of Montana would not be what it is if it wasn't for Forrest Anderson. And I think that's without a doubt. So when we say he's either one of, if not the most effective and important governor of the state of Montana, I think that resonates well with historians. So we're running out of time, but I want to thank you, Brian, for your wonderful insights. And I want to thank you, Newell, for your personal insights and political insights as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was fun.